Grain is the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And upon eating the grain, the man and the woman created an incident or an occurrence for mankind, for all mankind. Prior to eating grain, the man and the woman had no concept of the knowledge of good or the knowledge of evil. Now we have to ask ourselves or wonder, did they truly receive it? And I believe the answer comes in the story itself. After eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, the man and the woman, knowing that they're naked, clothe themselves and hide themselves. When God returns to the garden, he finds the man and the woman clothed, and for this he asked the man, "How did you know you were naked? Have you been eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil?" And the man tells him that the woman had given him the fruit to eat. And God turns on the woman and asks her, "Why did you do this?" And the woman answers him that the serpent had convinced her to eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And therein lies our answer. Man and woman were given or ate the knowledge of good and evil because they were now able to answer the question, how and why? How did you know that you were naked? Why did you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil? Why did you eat the grain? How being representative of the knowledge of good, why being representative of a knowledge of evil, but not so much good and evil in archaic terms, but more wisdom and freedom. How do I accomplish something? Why am I accomplishing something? Much larger concepts, much more complicated concepts to understand, but basic enough that we understand them till today. These are obviously also the questions that make us unique to the entire animal planet, the animal kingdom. No other animals on this planet can question how or why, nor can any other animal question or respond to how or why. These were indications that we truly had at that point achieved or received the knowledge of good and evil. These are the questions that eventually would build our moralities. But at the same time, these are very large concepts to understand all at once. And they beg the question, what happened to the other four questions? Well, before eating grain, they must have come in the time before eating grain. So we're left with four questions that must have occurred at different times. Now, if we follow the course of the story, from the beginning of chapter 2 until the banishment of the garden, the first set of questions that we obviously are answered for us are when and where. We're given a time and a place for this garden. As the story progresses, God puts a man in the garden and tells him to name all of the animals, which answers the question of what. Then a woman arrives and he knows her, and that answers the question of whom. So within the story itself, there's a natural progression of human thought that would rival our own beginning or ways of learning or coming to know knowledge from the moment that we're born, or even prior to that. In the very beginning, we understand when and where, what and whom, and eventually we understand how and why. Now, how and why in the story arrive at the same time. So I don't know if that means that the other four questions arrived simultaneously or near simultaneously of each other. So obviously what this leads us with if we see it in this form, would be three sets of separate perspectives, or three sets of opposing questions, each one in itself kind of binding to the other. Now, this may be particular just to the English language, but generally when we do think in terms of when, we follow it up with where. Whenever your question like, when is this going to happen, one of the first things you tend to think after that is, well, where is it going to happen at? When is the meeting? Where's it going to be at? So we have in here a sense of time and place, which would answer our perspective of just wanting, spatial relations. The next one is when we think of things in terms of what. So many times we'll follow up with the question of like who. What do you have there? Well, who is it for? Who are you giving that to? Or who are you giving that gift to? I'm giving it to them. Well, what is it? So there's a sense of wanting to answer, or there's a objectification as well as subjectification, and trying to resolve that perspective. And then finally the questions of answering the how and the why, for lack of better terms, just the rational and the irrational. So what we have here also is a progression of human thought that we can see in immediate terms when we think of our own being, of how we begin, our early life, as a newborn. We think of things in terms of when and where. When I cry, someone will attend to me. Or we also respond to where. If you play peekaboo with a baby, they'll tend to look for where you are, where did you go. So there's an early understanding of space and time. It's just a way of being able to come into sync with our own natural world. And as we move along, then we begin to see things in terms of objectifying and subjectifying. We know we can answer what questions. What is a bottle? What is blanket? What is music? As well as whom. Is this my mother? Is this my father? Do I know these people? And then eventually, as we come into early childhood, and one of the first things that we notice about our own children is when they answer questions about how or why, or they ask us questions. Why is the sky blue, and how are babies made? And at that point, we know that in a sense they've kind of arrived in their own being at that point. In a much larger scale, looking at mankind, this obviously also leads a trail or a progression of the growth of human thought throughout history as well, with the early stages just being able to understand when and where, and what would be kind of a revolutionary way of thinking at the time. But by modern standards, it's obviously something that's very fundamental or primary compared to the questions that we can answer now. So one of the other aspects that I was considering was the aspect of the grain, the wheat, the transition of being able to go from these four questions into asking how and why. But the aspect of the grain to me was troubling because it's very complex to say that man was just able to transition that fast into understanding how to use grain. It seems like in and of itself you'd have to process it. To make bread, to make alcohol, there would have to be some true knowledge at that point. So it makes me question whether or not there may have been other incidences that came prior. If there were other natural elements that would bring us to the point where we would understand grain and the ability to use it, to use it for our benefit. And at this point, it just becomes really a contrivance on my part. There's no part aspect that lends anything to the actual presentation other than to say that if I were to consider that there were any other incidences of, or natural instances, they came because of our our use of legumes, possibly at this time frame, and just to be arbitrary, just use cucumbers. These being squashes, pumpkins, these type of plants. The reason why I chose these two, well, obviously legumes being, I think beans, things of these nature, beans, seeds, or peanuts. I'd have to look a little bit further into the varieties, but the thing that I was particular about these two variety of plants was that they're obviously something that are kind of what we consider staple of our own diets today. You know, cucumbers being like vegetables, you know, legumes being more protein. These are things that we require in our diet today as well. But also because, again, just being arbitrary, the aspect of oil, the fact that we were moving from a basic fruit, something that may have had an oil content in it as well. Maybe not as concentrated as, well, obviously not as concentrated as maybe wheat or grain or corn or any of these things, but within itself it provided an oil, and but it also seemed like a very basic fruit, something that you could access simply by cracking it, taking a pumpkin and smashing it. Now, the legumes to me seemed a little bit more complex because they were more of a seed, something you would have to work at, something that you would have to kind of labor for, something that would require a little bit more detail, a little more attention. But they also provide, I believed, was an oil, like as well, like, and then eventually arriving to grain, which would require the same kind of attention that cucumbers and legumes would require, where you would need the kind of detail and refinement to process grain. But the fact that you would have to process grain, this would be the most advanced or the up-to-date way of accessing obviously these abstracts that they seem to provide. Now, the whole intention was to see if there was a natural progression, a natural way of achieving this that wasn't, completely within, beyond the realm of belief. So to say that, our instance of just the growth of human thought could be attributed to the plant kingdom, to me seemed very accessible. So removing this aspect from the second and third chapter leading up to the banishment, removing this aspect out of the story, that leaves us with the following. The broken rib, the serpent, and the three curses.